Welcome, everyone. My name is Serkan. I'm one of the program director in ECPS, the European Center for Populism Studies, which is an independent non-profit organization based in Brussels. So our aim to make a research and analysis of political populism nowadays, which is becoming a challenge to European liberal democracy. So here we look at populist politics and authoritarian tendencies, which is more visible now everywhere, by making some research as well as some organizing like panels like this series. And this is our second series, mapping European populism. And now today we will cover Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. I'd like to thank you again for every speaker, every participant and attendees. So I will give floor to the Daphne, please. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi everyone, and welcome to this panel on mapping European populism and mapping populism in South Europe. I'm really happy to be here among old friends and some new friends, and I will be moderating this panel. So I'll just first start by introducing our speakers, and then I'm going to have a few words, broad words on populism in South Europe before we listen to everyone's talk. Just to say that obviously we will be having a Q&A session after all the talks, except the first talk, Oscar. I'll explain in a minute. He will be leaving us early, so we'll take questions after his talk immediately. So we have a full 2 hours, so hopefully that will give us enough time to have a really interesting discussion about populism in South Europe. So we have, as I said, a few words by myself, and then we are going to have a talk by Oscar Mazzoleni, Sofia Vasilopoulou, Andrés Santana, and Susana Salgado in that order. So to introduce our speakers, starting with Oscar Mazzoleni is professor at Institute of Political Studies and Research Center for Political Action. His research interests are comparative politics, political parties, Italian politics, mobilization, political elites, and populism. Professor Sofia Vasilopoulou, she's professor of politics at the University of York. Her work examines political dissatisfaction with democracy and democratic institutions across Europe. Specific themes include Euroscepticism, extremism, and loss of faith in traditional politics. Her research is situated in the broader fields of European Union politics, comparative European politics, political behavior, and party politics. Next, Andrés Santana is professor of political science at the Political Science Department of the Autonomous University at Madrid. Last time I introduced André, I tried to pronounce all this in Spanish, but this time I'm sticking to the English version. He's currently researching populism, turnout, vote choice, and MPs, and is passionate about methodology and quantitative research techniques. And last but not least, Susana Salgado is professor of political communication, media, and politics. She is currently a principal researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon. Her research topics include populism, online hate, polarization, disinformation, political communication, comparative media studies, media and democratization, media and elections, and internet and politics. I will introduce the title of each talk as we go along, but before I do that, there's 10 minutes in the program for me just to quickly introduce the topic. And I thought when I was invited to do this, to moderate this panel, I thought it's really interesting because there are some really interesting patterns on populism to be identified generally in South Europe. So these countries that we're looking at today, Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal, they offer a very interesting, I think, contrast that give us a lot of insights about what has been going on. So I'm just going to share my screen. I am focusing in my very brief 10 minutes on right-wing populism, because I guess that's what I'm mostly interested in. But I think that there are broad populism patterns generally to be identified. So let me just share. No, first I have to open this, and then let me just share my screen. So everyone, I hope can see this, but of course now view slideshow. Okay. So as I said, what I was hoping to do is identify certain patterns between these countries since sort of the eruption, I'd say, of the economic crisis that has somehow coincided with different patterns of specifically far-right populism, but also broadly speaking populism. And I want to focus on three types of patterns: patterns of success, patterns of supply, in other words, what the parties themselves do or stand for, and third, patterns of demand, or in other words, what do the voters of these parties look like? And to do that is just a very brief introduction, but I am drawing on various dimensions of my work to show you this. So when it comes to success is actually in South Europe, I find a real puzzle. The patterns of success, specifically of right-wing populism, because they really sort of defy our expectations of what should have happened. And I've grouped the countries in twos. Greece and Italy, I've got here sort of the, if you like, the electoral performance of right-wing populist parties in Greece and Italy in the past sort of 15 years or so. And Greece and Italy, they are, if you like, similar in that somehow right-wing populist parties have increased their support during the economic crisis and after it. And what is interesting, I mean, you can see Greece has had quite a lot of different right-wing populist parties, but A, they've had a fair amount of votes, so they've had a decent performance, but B, and interestingly, they've had varied entry in government. These Pasolaos, for example, in Greece was in the government, obviously the Lega in Italy as well. So generally speaking, I would put Greece and Italy in the success cases, versus very interestingly, Spain and Portugal, where I would say success has been completely contrary to our expectations, rather limited. If I was to add the left-wing pattern here, we could definitely see that in terms of left-wing populism, Spain had much more with Podemos. But generally speaking, despite the economic crisis, despite fairly high levels of immigration in both countries, Vox only recently has started doing quite well. And Chega in Portugal, I would say, and of course, we're going to hear much more about this from the expert, but is far more limited. So regarding patterns of success, I think that there are interesting puzzles here, but also very interesting variations if we were to consider South Europe as sort of four countries that have similar trajectories and similar developments. Now, in terms of supply, I think there's also some really interesting patterns here in terms of what the parties do. And here I would simply categorize Greece as the outlier versus the other parties, right? And that is just simply because of the extremism, if you like, that increased in Greece with the Golden Dawn versus all the others. And I've got I think everyone is familiar with the Golden Dawn, currently in prison for murder, grievous bodily harm, and various other lovely things. But what is striking about what happened in Greece is that this extreme organization of criminals who are now indicted criminals entered the parliament, and while on the one hand nobody wanted to have anything to do with them, and they didn't obviously enter any coalitions or anything like that, they did become quite entrenched in the political system. We'll hear much more about that later. This was a neo-Nazi, a clearly neo-Nazi party. There's also debates as to whether we can categorize this as populist, right? Versus Spain, Italy, and Portugal, where in fact the equivalent extremists have not gained any votes. And the parties that did gain votes were more the moderate, the radical right, the parties that tried to portray themselves as more legitimate and more at least not racist. So I'm not saying, by the way, that these parties are not racist, and I'm not saying that these parties are nice. What I'm saying is that it's an analytical point, not a normative point. What I'm saying is that the narratives that these parties have employed are very different. So in a way, in Greece, you had a far-right party gain votes because of its extremism, whereas perhaps in the other countries, you have radical right or populist radical right parties gain votes sort of despite, if you like, their extremism. But then finally, and this is, so this is from some research I'm doing now with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, analyzing the voter profiles. Now, what is actually really interesting is that despite these sort of differences in supply, there are many similarities in the voter profiles, and we can discuss that later, right? So what we've done here, unfortunately, I don't have any data for Portugal because this is data from the European Social Survey. And there isn't, obviously, because Chega is so new, there isn't much on Chega. The top is Italy, sorry, there's no name in the bubble. But what this tells us here is that there are some patterns, despite the different, despite the different supply, despite the different party narratives, the most likely voter is very similar. What we've done here is we've calculated different, the different configurations, different profiles, creating the most likely voter, far-right voter in each country versus the least likely far-right voter in this country. And what you can see, okay, there are certain differences, but mostly speaking, the South European pattern, male individuals who have very strong immigration concerns and tend to be religious, are the most likely far-right voter. There are some differences in terms of age, and there are some differences in terms of income group, but broadly speaking, the profiles are very similar compared to the big differences that we see in the supply. So this is just me. So essentially what I've wanted to highlight here is what an interesting comparison between these different 4 countries that we could study. There's interesting variations in terms of success and supply, but maybe similarities in terms of demand. There are cross-cutting patterns depending on what you look at between the different countries. And I really look forward now to hearing each of the presentations to see, what kind of patterns and what kind of insights we might get for each case. So without further ado, I would like to now pass on to our first speaker, who I will repeat is Oscar Mazzoleni, and will present to us a paper called Multiple Populism, Italian Multiple Populism, Evidence, Causes and Impact. So to you.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, it's working fine.
Sorry. So thank you very much for this invitation. Very glad to share with you some reflection on this Italian case, and my focus is dimension, of course, concerned first of all in my studies on right-wing populism. Can you? Yes, I have a problem with the connection. Sorry, but I think it's important in the Italian case to underline that we are in front of a much more broader or complex phenomenon in populism, as a populism. And I think why we should or we can speak about multiple populism for 3 main reasons. The first is the persistent presence over time of Italians in Italian party system of populists of different ideological or perspective since the 1990s. So I think that's important in this sense, to the long-term 30 years, an enduring presence. Second, the fact that a party called populist compete or as a cooperative pattern each other at the same time in different period on electoral arena in parliament and government. So there is this, in sense, the multiple is connected with the interaction among this party and of course other parties. And the third dimension of this multiple character of populism in Italy is that the fact that we have here different kind of ideological supply, regionalist, radical right, nationalist, left-wing, moderate, and syncretic. Is the five-star movement is I'm going to present this five-star movement is in between, and this express this ideological flexibility and complexity. So this, in this sense, if you look at the parties that the literature consider more or less in nowadays or during the last 30 years as populist, we have at least four parties. The Lega Nord, now Lega, from the right-wing regionalist toward right-wing nationalism. Forza Italia, led by Berlusconi. Of course, we can discuss if nowadays is a populist parties, but there is a relevant case in the last 30 years. The five-star movement, of course, from left-wing, the beginning progressive party, now it's much more complex. And of course, Fratelli d'Italia, Italian brothers, mentioned also by Daphne, a far right-wing nationalist party close to the fascist tradition. And also this diversity is not just the diversity in terms of ideology, but it's also connected with the government participation experiences. So that's important, that almost all this party have been with interruption some government experience in coalitions, and except from Italian brothers, and this also is also in connection with this diversity of this party. And the question also, of course, this diversity, it's uneasy to explain. Of course, if you take each party in singular, I think it's much more easier to define individual, micro explanation in terms of voting behavior. But the question is also the broad picture. And the question is how you explain the persistence over time of different kind of populism, the ideological diversity, the variation in voting support. Of course, each of these topics is relevant and it should be considered in a single way. At the same time, we have also this case is particularly interesting because of this diversity persistence over time, and we can also try to identify some features, some pattern, trying to explain in a macro way why this kind of populist challenge in Italy. And I think there are some enduring element that you have to consider from institutional point of view. First of all, low legitimation, the stability of the rule of the game, shifting electoral system over time from proportional to majoritarian, and the changing parliamentary coalition also, the high government instability, which is higher in the last 30 years than before, in terms of ideological belonging of the member of the government, of course, and low political trust within public opinion. This is a long trend in public opinion in Italy, and especially low trust toward political parties. Especially on political parties. That's important, and this is also another aspect that is also open to the question about media and communication sphere, is the strong legitimation of the anti-political elite discourse in the public sphere connected with anti-corruption stances. That's important to also to explain the context and what I say, the structural opportunity. In this sense, all these aspects, including also, and not least, it's important, the high financial incentive for new actor to enter politics. Remember that MPs in Italy are the best salaries in a comparative way in Europe. And the enduring, all this aspect is explained also the enduring openness of the structural opportunity for new actors, and also the capacity to endure during the last 30 years. That's important, in my opinion, to contextualize Italian case. And of course, some authors, as Starkey and others, talk about Italy as a laboratory of populism in Europe, and connected with the two element, of course, relevant, important point, that the strong breakdown of the party system at the beginning of the 90s is specific of course, in Italy, in a comparative way. So it's the disappearance, the breakdown of old mass party organization founded after the Second World War, in particular the Christian Democrat Party and the Communist Party. So it's completely a new party system in the 90s in Italy. It's a really relevant point that explains this openness of the system, and also a really huge redefinition of the relation between politics and media, with rising mediologic new private broadcast, and what a guy is called Gianpietro Mazzoleni, it's not myself, called media populism. So I think it's very important that in this context, Italian context, also explaining by Berlusconi experience coming from the media, and also coming in from the outsider, from the media to politics, and that's also a very important element in this redefinition. And of course, the question is not only the question of structural opportunities, but also the flexibility of the ideological stances of leaders and the parties. If you look at Berlusconi, Grillo, Conte, but also Bossi, Salvini, Meloni, it's interesting how they deal with the ideological stances in a very flexible way along the experience of these different parties and the leadership experience, with a strong professional political marketing oriented supply. So they really change agenda program in a way, and it is interesting. This is of course connected. That's some studies show that connected with electoral uncertainty, with success failure of the parties over time, and the difficulties of this leader to manage their authority inside the party. And that's important also to explain why this party can be moderate, or can moderate their supply during government experience. They change their agenda and discourse. That's also, of course, is a crucial element in order to explain variation over time or of their ideological stances. And I think, as a comparative politics scholar, we have to be careful about the reduction of the study of the impact of populist challenge in Western Europe when you consider only politics and policy, when we consider all demand and supply. I think it's very important in this sense. If we have a populist challenge over time, or spread out from different parties and across ideology, it's important to see the impact in terms of polity changes, and also the context change. In terms of performative style, I think it's important to consider this point also for in focusing on mainstream parties, because this distinction between, of course, we can open the discussion about what populism is. Of course, myself, I consider populism in a different definition, using, could be style, ideology, discourse, but in this sense specifically, I think the performative style, Moffitt, in the Moffitt term, is spread out in the Italian system, also blurring the distinction between populist and non-populist in a way. It also connected with the anti-party attitudes. So all this supply success of different parties is coming from different perspectives, ideological perspectives, also to boost anti-party attitudes over time, and transforming democratic communication, but also reshaping judicial and constitutional rules. It's also important, creating again, reshaping the structural opportunity over time, helping to create the condition for new success. That's important in this sense to connect politics, policy, and polity dimension of populist success. So to conclude, Italian multiple populism takes different forms and paths. Italy might be seen as a laboratory of multiple populism, has the persisting chameleontic presence of many populist actors over the last 30 years. There are many possible explanations of multiple populism, although the key factors seem to be linked to a high openness of the structural opportunity for anti-establishment actors. Relevant is also the multiple impact politics, policy, and polity over time. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to answer to your question.
Thank you so much for that, Oscar. So many really interesting ideas here. So I can take questions. We can either, you just raise your hand. I see, yeah, I have hands already. I'll just finish and then, so either raise your hand or just put it in the chat. Bülent has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oscar. It's an interesting presentation. I wonder about some neo-fascist movements in Italy. Yeah, we have some left-wing populist movements like Five Star Movement and radical right populist movements, but also neo-fascist movements like Casa Pound. What do you think about Casa Pound, especially in regard of the Italian legal framework? Isn't there any remedy to not permit such kind of neo-fascist movements to have effect in Italian politics? Thank you.
So I can respond immediately. Okay. So Casa Pound is not. So I was concentrated on electoral oriented parties. Of course, Casa Pound is a strong movement, but it's not really connected with electoral dimensions, and is close now to Fratelli d'Italia. Is a kind of ideological supporter of Fratelli d'Italia. It was close to the Lega Nord, and is important in terms of ideological supply, of course, in the debate of the extreme right, Italian right. But of course, is this populism? I'm just wondering about that. So, in terms of ideology or a style of discourse, is connected in this sense, not in terms. So that might answer. So that's I recognize my perspective was on populism and less on far right in general, because we have other cases, relevant cases. If you will look at the far right, I think we should include Casa Pound.
Thank you so much, Sofia.
Yes, thanks. That was a very interesting presentation. I just have a question about Berlusconi, basically. And it's just a curiosity, because you kind of mentioned him in passing. So I wonder, what's your view on him? Do you think he was ever a populist or not? Did his policies to some extent pave the way for the populism of now? You talked a little bit about institutional checks and balances. So was he a populist, or was it something related to more kind of illiberal attitudes towards democracy? Where would you place him, and to what extent did his actions whilst in government for so many years pave the way to what we see today? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think if you want to focus Italian populism, I think we have to include a different definition of populism. I think so the populist style. So the idea of the big man or the big woman spread out to the people, representing the people. In the also strategic definition by Weyland, we can consider Berlusconi as such, as a populist. Of course, if you look at in terms of ideology, we can be in modern definition. You can say, okay, now it's just more moderate, and in terms of ideological stances, it's European oriented in the last time. But that's an aspect of the agenda. And what I think it's relevant is in Italian case is the extreme flexibility of the supply and the agenda of these parties. You are no consistent in time proposal by Berlusconi. So it changed 10 times about Europe, about plenty of topics. What is the continuity is the idea that he embody Italian willing, and this idea to represent something and to represent this idea to the good Italian willing, and this discourse is expressed over time. The idea to be the leader of the right coalition, the big man, the leader, the charismatic leader. This always this story tell in this sense. So I think it's this sense is a populist leader with of course a party with a very, very complex story, because it's in crisis, because there is a split and so. But in this sense, it remains, in my opinion, a populist leader in this specific sense of the style. And that is the creator, of course, the complexity. And this chameleontic also expression of populism, if you want to, which we can mention Taggart, that's it. And it's difficult to capture. And in sometimes could be very moderate, accepting everything about the Draghi government, and 2 days after is another appeal, another discourse, and that's the complicated task that we have if you want just to put a label as a populist or not populist.
Thank you. And we have a question from Maximilian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your interesting talk, Professor Mazzoleni. I was wondering, you mentioned the extreme ideological flexibility. And of course, I think to some degree, ideological flexibility is something that many, if not all, populists share, or that is a characteristic that is often linked to populism. So I was wondering, do you think Italy is a special case? Like, do you think the flexibility in Italy is unique compared to other countries? And if so, or even if not, what factors do you see as causing Italian the Italian space as being particularly malleable compared to some others? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I try to say that first of all, this capacity, the populism to spread out, to be across ideologies, I think it's specific, I think, in Europe. So, of course, you can have the Spain case on the left wing, right wing, but it's much more clear, in my opinion, but we can discuss about Podemos nowadays. But in this case, it's every new parties coming in the system is expressed to some extent populist stances in Italy in the last 30 years. It's of course we can say Partito Democratico. It's different, and probably is the exception. So if you look at the system, the exception is the non-populist parties. The rest are more or less influenced by populist stances. I think it's a characteristic of a very, very communication oriented system. With the media system, it's totally embedded in this sense. In the in the media stances, in the development of media stances, is completely embedded. And the other point is the difficulties for the system to create a new stability, new established parties able to exclude or to compete in a clear way with the others. So if you look at this Portugal, if you look at Greece, if you look at this in other countries in Europe, we have some traditional parties, long-standing parties, more or less connected with the mainstream. In Italy, you have the Partito Democratico, but is in a minority position. A minority position is a unique case. Previously was, of course, as you know, the communists and Christian Democrats together in this new party, and the rest is difficult to label these parties as mainstream with all these parties existing in Italian party system. So it is instability, and this create, of course, the capacity to populism to maintain. Of course, populism is a big resources. Populism is, in this sense, is a tool by which all these parties and leaders try to survive in an unstable, in an uncertain environment. And of course, now we have a government by Draghi, so the big boss. But we have next year with new elections, and elections is an open box in this sense. We don't know what happened, and a new story will be the case, because nobody know what will happen in 2023 after the national elections. That's it, and it's open the box again, and it's in this sense, populism is here for staying, especially in Italy. Also because this general uncertain environment in terms of party politics and also party government.
Okay, super. There's no other hands up, so I will very quickly, if that's okay with everyone, abuse my position as chair and ask you a question myself, which is something I've been struggling. So I've been listening very carefully to your presentation and the answer to your questions about how most parties in the system now in Italy are populist, and I've written a paper myself with Sofia saying that most Greek parties are populist, and I've struggled this, and I guess my question is simply, what is the added value of using the term populism to describe these parties? If in a way it captures, if it's about whatever, if it's about anti-establishment, we have a term to capture that. If it's about nationalism, we have something to capture that, right? So what
Absolutely.
does populism add that we don't already have as a category that analytically helps us, rather than just allowing us to rant about parties that we don't like?
I have two answers. The first is the chameleontic nature of populism by Taggart, and all nationalists, right-wing and others definition is do not capture this element of chameleontic and changing and I have another concept one in Wodak, ambiguity, and I think that's a real add value, because in populist discourse, look, the term of discourse or rhetoric is based, in my sense, if you look at this some point of Canavan populism 1998 and Ruud Wodak, is the capacity to be here and at the same time not to be here. Sorry, we can hear not be here. So I'm a party of government, but at the same time I play as a positional party. I'm a very moderate, but at the same time can be extreme, and I can be of a party, but at the same time there are some MPs. You can develop a party with this apparent inconsistent supply, and it's my opinion that the add value of populism in terms of from an analytical point of view stay here. So to connect with different ideology, in a flexible way, not just to say, okay, populist is right wing or left wing, but also right wing can be at the same time also develop some different stances different than the right wing, or the left wing the same. And not in, if you, all the parties are inconsistent, but they have some problem to manage that in terms of internal consensus, internal support. In this party, in this sense, if you have no problem in terms of consistency, because you target different electorate in different way, that's a component, a crucial component of populism. The populism is the resources to manage inconsistency.
Fantastic. I'm going to definitely use the use inconsistency. I really like that. Okay. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. And we're very sorry that you won't be staying for more discussions. But we do hope to catch up again soon with Oscar. So next here is Sofia will be talking to us about populism in Greece.
Yes, thank you. Let me just...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Thank you.
How is this looking? Is this working okay? Yes, okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this really interesting panel on populism in South Europe. So I'm going to use the next 10 to 15 minutes to give you a bit of an overview of what's going on in Greece. I guess the first thing I want to do is to highlight that now we are at the end of March 2022, which is almost 10 years after the 2012 seismic elections in Greece, the May and June 2012 elections that really changed the party system as we knew it at the time. So I would like to briefly take you back in time and just very, very briefly talk about these elections. They took place within a context of severe economic crisis, rising unemployment, high levels of public debt, recession, and so on. And really, I want to highlight two kind of observations here. First, on the left side of politics, we saw that the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Party, PASOK, which was essentially one of the two main parties for the previous 30 years, for the first time comes third. And in its place, we see the rise of a radical left party, Syriza, the coalition of the radical left, which essentially becomes very successful, whilst previously only having about 3 to 5% of the vote. So we see a dramatic rise of the far left, Syriza. Now, on the right, we see another development, very important development for Greek politics, which is the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn enters the Greek parliament with 7% of the vote. I mean, this is a quite high percentage, considering, as Daphne already mentioned, the profile of the party, which is pretty much very close to being against democracy. So we've argued in our joint work that this economic crisis was actually much more than an economic crisis. It was more of a political crisis that shook the very foundations of the institutional system in Greece. Radicalism was clearly on the rise, both on the left and the right, but how persistent was this trend? So to answer this question, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what happened in the last two elections that were held in Greece in 2015 and 2019. So on the right side of the panel, you see the electoral results of the 2015 elections, which equally took place in the midst of the crisis, with dramatic levels of unemployment, debt, austerity measures being discussed, and so on, where actually Syriza on the left becomes the first party So the party essentially was preferred by over 35% of the electorate. This is a dramatic rise for this party. As I said before, it was a very, very marginal before 2012. However, despite this rise, the party does not have enough votes or seats rather in order to form a single party majority government, and it ends up working in coalition with the radical right ANEL. That's the party of the independent Greeks. At the time, this was a coalition that was rather unexpected in the Greek electorate, not least because these two parties don't share anything ideologically. Actually, they are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, on the right, we see again the persistence of the Golden Dawn, which keeps getting 7% of the vote, despite the fact that already by 2015, the party was associated with a number of violent acts against immigrants, against Greek left-wing activists, and so on. Now, fast forward in 2019, which is the latest election, perhaps one could say we experienced a little bit more stability in comparison from the point of view that the first party, which was New Democracy on this occasion, actually managed to have enough seats in order to form a single party majority government, which is more in line with Greek political culture. So Greek political culture does not sit very comfortably with coalition government, I don't think. I think it's fair to say that. Now, on the left, Syriza loses some support, not that much. I will come back to that in a moment. And then when it comes to the right, the Golden Dawn does not achieve the 3% required threshold to gain seats in the parliament. Yet it just loses that very marginally, I should say. Yet a new radical right party, what is EL there is a Greek solution, Elliniki Lisi, actually manages enough votes in order to enter the parliament with some seats. Now, after giving you this kind of overview of elections pretty much in the last 10 years in Greece, let me zoom on two specific parties that I think are relevant for our discussions. I'm sorry. So I'm going to start with Syriza, kind of radicalism of the left. Now, while Syriza was in opposition, I will still want to remind you that this was a very minor party, electorally speaking, before 2012. And after that, whilst in opposition, it campaigned on a radical left ticket, clear discussions against imperialism, against capitalism, against neoliberalism, and actually substantively it criticized quite a lot what the party thought was the decline of liberal democracy, meaning that quite a lot of groups were not really represented in the democratic process. Yet, when the party actually became the government, as I mentioned earlier, after the 2015 elections, it went completely against its pre-electoral promises and instead carried out a strict fiscal consolidation program and toned down significantly its references to anti-capitalism, imperialism, and so on. So I have a couple of examples of how some slogans changed, and there's multiple examples here. So where we saw at the beginning slogans like for a government of the left, this changed to a government of national salvation. Slogans such as redistribution of power, wealth, and income for labor, obviously a very kind of a left-wing kind of slogans, changed to a productive reconstruction of the country. And as I say, there's multiple examples. These are only two. So despite this change, and essentially despite the fact that the governmental record of the party does not necessarily tie with its pre-electoral promises, the party essentially came second in 2019, but retained most of its support, which points towards a degree of consolidation of the party in the system. Now, the picture is not quite as positive for the Golden Dawn, on the other hand, in the sense that this was a party that experienced dramatic rise, very quick rise, but potentially also dramatic fall. So the context of the party's demise, electoral demise, was the murder of Pavlos Fyssas in 2013, who was a Greek anti-fascist activist. Now, I should say that even before that, there were a lot of incidents that, violent incidents, especially against immigrants, that the Golden Dawn was associated with. But it seems that this murder sparked the legal system and the judiciary to go against the party. Now, the trial started in 2015. I will remind you that already in 2015, they still get 7% of the vote, despite the fact that the trial has started. Anyway, after 5 years, in October 2020, there were a number of verdicts against the Golden Dawn. These included running a criminal organization, especially for the leader and a few kind of close other leaders, joining a criminal organization, being involved in violent acts against immigrants, left-wing opponents, and so on. Now, sentences varied between 5 and 15 years, except one person, the individual who was directly associated with the murder, who received a life sentence. So how can we interpret all this that I'm telling you? I mean, on the one hand, as I said, this kind of remains, right, in terms of electoral power, yet it has toned down its radicalism, to say the least. On the other hand, the Golden Dawn is in jail. Yeah. So is this a sign? Is it a sign of democratic resilience, as it were? Can we interpret that in these terms? So to answer this question, what I want to do is take you towards the demand side of electoral politics. So I've talked already about the parties and what has happened with the parties, their agendas, and so on. I want to spend a few more minutes to talk about the political attitudes of the Greek citizens. And I want to focus specifically on the questions related to the principles of liberal democracy, because I think this is a very important topic that could relate to populism in general terms, and potentially, in my opinion, is even more important than populism per se. Now, what are the principles of liberal democracy? I mean, there could be a number, but the most important ones are checks and balances to limit executive power and protect minorities, okay? Of course, we have majority control, but we need to protect minorities within that. And of course, respect for the rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, and so on. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is I'm going to show you some data from the European election study of 2019. Daphne, Andrés, and myself and some other colleagues are actually just on the field on a specific survey on populism in Southern Europe, but unfortunately the data was not ready yet. But I think this data is already quite suggesting. So I have questions. I'll show you answers of Greek respondents on questions that tap into the independence of judiciary, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, checks and balances on the executive, and last, and more of the idea about the will of people and citizen representation. And this is to show to you that there are significant minorities amongst the Greek electorate, which hold illiberal attitudes. So let me just guide you through a few of these points here. So yeah, so the first graph here is about support for an independent judiciary. So respondents were asked to either agree or disagree with the following statement. Independent judges should be able to overrule the decisions of democratically elected government if the decisions violate the rights of individuals or groups in society. So agreement with this question indicates more liberal kind of attitudes, essentially support for an independent judiciary that is going to bring checks and balances on the government. And what we see on the graph on your right side, we see about 10% of respondents that disagree with this statement, which to a large extent I think is quite worrisome. And even more worrisome, we have about a fifth of the respondents in the middle who neither agree or disagree, which means they're sort of sitting on the fence, right? So these kind of individuals could be persuaded both ways. moving on to a question on freedom of speech. Here, the statement was governments should be allowed to prohibit a peaceful protest if many citizens will be offended by its slogans. Now, if you agree with this question, that indicates more illiberal attitudes because it's about prohibition of freedom of speech. And note that the question here refers to a peaceful protest, right? So because obviously if there are some protests that are not peaceful, maybe there are other reasons there. Actually, the results here are rather worrisome as well. We have about a quarter of the respondents that agree that governments can and should prohibit a peaceful protest, and again about a quarter that sits in the middle. I'm going to move on and give you a bit more of a positive outlook. When it comes to the freedom of press, actually the outlook is slightly more positive. Here the statement is, in order to secure the independence of public media, elected politicians should have no influence on the content of their broadcasting. So illiberal attitudes, i.e. people who disagree, I mean, still it's a substantive minority, but it's much lower levels than the questions that I mentioned earlier. Now, another question here is about the checks and balances on the executive. And here respondents have been invited to either agree or disagree with a statement: having a strong leader in government is good for Greece, even if the leader bends the rules to get things done. Now, again, quite worrisome. We've got about a quarter of the population, I should say actually the respondents, but the sample has been representative, so we can extrapolate to the population from that. But if you add the fully agree and the agree, the people who answered either that they fully agree or they agree with the statement, we are reaching about a quarter of the respondents. And again, we have about a quarter of the respondents who sit in the middle. So I'm going to let you think about this data. I'm going to move on to the last question, actually, that relates to points about liberal democracy, and this statement was about the people and not the politicians should make our most important policy decisions. Now that depends how it will be read, because obviously the people make decisions, but they do make decisions through the means of representation, right? The representative democracy. So politicians are there because we delegate as citizens authority through the representative means of elections for them to take decisions. And here, actually, what we see is that over half of the Greek electorate on the left actually think that the people should make decisions, which I thought was quite an interesting percentage that I should highlight to you. Now, the last statistic that I want to show you is about levels of satisfaction with the way democracy works in Greece. And here, dissatisfaction is shown by the yellow and the gray pieces of the pie, and these together make up about 3/4, 75% of Greeks who actually don't feel satisfied with the way democracy works in Greece currently. So taken together, what does this all mean? I mean, I think the data show significant minorities who hold illiberal attitudes. And in some cases, they're not even minorities, right? They're something a bit more than minorities, which at the moment do not find expression in the party system. As I showed you, especially support for the Golden Dawn at the moment is waning. But these kinds of attitudes are likely to pose a threat to the system and a threat to democracy, especially if they find political expression in the future. So that's all I had to say. I hope that was clear, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Wow, some really worrying results. Does anybody have any questions for Sofia? Perhaps I will, if anybody doesn't, not yet. Let me start, because I have a few. Again, abusing my, oh no, actually Bulent wants to start, so I'll come second. Bulent.
Thank you very much, Sofia, for all this eye-opening presentation and all the opening information about Greek population. My question is that almost every European country has far-right groups like Golden Dawn. They are often part of a larger right-wing extremist networks with small loyal bases. However, Golden Dawn went mainstream soon after announcing its first major election campaign in the middle of refugee crisis, financial and political problems. While all Greek major parties were losing votes over their handling of these problems, I am talking about the past, not the new. Golden Dawn gained support and became the third biggest party. Later, its support has declined, as you said. I think not because of its political stance, but the serious crimes its leaders and members committed, which were sentenced by the Greek courts, as you mentioned. Moreover, anti-migrant ultranationalist party, Greek Solution, partially replaced the Golden Dawn, and even New Democracy Party has embraced some far-right politicians who ran successful campaigns in the elections. Despite this, all this information, can we still argue that popular support for extremist political movements and far-right populist parties is generally conjunctural, and with the changes in conjunction, their power also changed? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. I think kind of the first part of my presentation was to show you the electoral results. And electorally speaking, the Golden Dawn is not doing great at the moment. Yet, as you rightly pointed out, in 2015 already there were great suspicion about the association between Golden Dawn and the murder of Pavlos Fyssas, and they still received 7% of the vote, right? And in a way, this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to make this argument that there's latent support for these kinds of parties. And this is what I try to do through looking at questions that tap into different aspects of liberal democracy. Now, there's also a question of supply. The Golden Dawn won't be around for the foreseeable few years, but that does not mean that they might not return in the next 10 years and so on, because sentences between 5 to 10 years, if someone behaves really well in jail, could actually be reduced to 10 years and so on, right? And as we actually do know, in the past, Michalogliakos was in jail in the 80s and early 90s, and sometimes he used to actually still manage the party through, even though he was in jail. So if some individuals come out and he still wants to manage the party, he has done this before, it can still happen from prison. So yes, I don't think it's a very positive outlook for democracy, and potentially another variable here that has already been mentioned slightly is that New Democracy also has some politicians that are in very good positions, like ministers and so on, who have been previously associated with the far right. So they are trying to tap into that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Sofia. We have a written question. I'll read it out. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. Wondering about the youth, and if the research on the ground that is not yet completed included questions about the youth, how they see democracy, their contributions to both populism and democracy. What do we know about the generational gap in approaches to populist illiberal practices in democracy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I only had limited time of 15 minutes, so I couldn't go into depths. But I think in the Greek case, what you saw in terms of support for the Golden Dawn is that it came from older people and younger people. So you kind of have a gap of kind of middle-aged people, as it were, who normally don't tend to opt for such parties. And I think this is a broadly a European trend. But essentially, you see a kind of a curve. So you see mostly either older people or younger people. And overall, there is an issue about how young people see democracy these days and what we can do to strengthen their support for the system. I should add here, actually, that I compared Greece with the European average when I was doing the statistics. And by no means is Greece that different from the European average. So this is not just a Greek phenomenon, it is a widespread phenomenon in Europe. Obviously, there's variation across countries, but on average, Greece is not that far from, you know, the median, the middle of, the average of European citizens.
Thank you. There's no other hands for the moment, so I'll ask my question, I guess. Two questions I have. So the one is sort of came from what Bulent was asking, right? So you told us a lot, and I know we've looked at that on the latent support, and to what extent that means that, you know, other parties or the support for these parties is sort of congenital, but in a way it isn't, because there's been so much far-right support for different parties in Greece. And my question to you is, what does that mean about the mainstream? Similarly to what you asked Oscar about Berlusconi, right? So the question really is, what does that tell us about the mainstream right party? And in particular, knowing that actually the majority of far right parties, except the Golden Dawn, have actually been splinter parties of New Democracy. So that's my first question. But then the second question I had was, again, so you really interestingly presented us data about authoritarian, essentially anti-liberal or authoritarian attitudes. And that takes me again to really, what is this outcome that we are trying to explain? If we strip it all from its populism and, you know, like all this language that we use, are we really just talking here about the distinction between liberal democracy and authoritarianism?
Yes, okay, I'll start from your second question, actually, which I think is excellent. And I don't know if you noticed, I've used the word populism in the title of the presentation, but I didn't actually use it throughout. So I don't particularly think that populism helps us a lot, certainly not in the Greek case. And as we've worked, as our co-authored published work with Daphne has shown, there is populism can be found across the party system in Greece. So I certainly think that the data that I presented speak towards attitudes towards liberal democracy and not populism per se. What would be interesting as kind of future research is to actually see whether these attitudes only are associated with right-wing individuals, or whether they are more widespread across party lines in terms of the citizens. So I think that would be something quite nice to actually look at as a second step. Crucially, some of the percentages tell us, and that is going to link to your first question, that these are not 7% of the people, assuming that 7% of the people who vote for the Golden Dawn are loyalists, which might not, but let's just say that the data I showed is that in many questions, there were significant percentages, even 20 to 25%, which certainly tells you that the mainstream parties, especially New Democracy, have been able to essentially capture some of these voters. Now, it's very interesting because the New Democracy, at least traditionally, has been a party of kind of democracy and republicanism in a way, you know, against royalty back in the day, right, 30, 40 years ago. So it's quite interesting how this party has developed and evolved over time. The core point here is that there is latent support for such ideas. So you have two options as a political party, either to tackle them head on and go against them, or not to make them salient, don't talk about that. This is what New Democracy does, and essentially try to capture these votes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I am going to move on to the next. I think we were meant to have the Q&A in the end, but somehow we've ended up having it after each presentation. So I think that's fine now. We'll do that for everyone. But people can come in as well in the end when we're wrapping up if there's any question that you feel you've left out. So thank you, Sofia, very much for this really interesting presentation. And now we're going to pass on to Andre, who's going to enlighten us about Spain and populism there. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daphne, and thank you all for the invitation here. First thing I was thinking, by the way, I didn't prepare this as a PowerPoint presentation, but more of like a discussion. The first thing I was thinking about when receiving the invitation is that some years ago, we wouldn't have been invited in Spain because we didn't have any populist party in Spain. And actually, Spanish politics were quite boring. I mean, if we compare them to Italian politics, we are still boring and we will always be boring, but Spanish politics were boring. We only had two really relevant parties, the traditional Socialist Party, PSOE, and the traditional Conservative Party, the People's Party, PP. And together they got about 70–80% of the vote, more or less, depending on the elections. And that was going on since 1982 to at least 2011. So we were basically a two-party system with some minor parties which contributed to some votes, but mainly it was an issue of two really big parties, and some smaller parties, usually regional parties, which tended to do coalitions with the largest party, the one which got the highest number of votes. So something changed, but before it changed, Spain was pointed out, and it was not only Spain. I believe it was also Portugal, but Susana will tell us much better about that. So we were told, you look, Spain is not a good country for populist parties, and Spain is not a good country for far-right parties. No country for angry men, no country for this type of parties. And actually some of these parties, well, you know, we always have long lists of parties competing for elections, like 30 parties, 35 parties, something like that. But most of them get fewer than 5,000 votes. And all the far-right parties were just contributed to making our graveyards of parties larger. So we thought we were immune. We were not a place to be there. Suddenly, things started to change. And more or less about the same time, Podemos, at the left-wing side of the political spectrum, was born. The party has changed names, Podemos, then Unidos Podemos, which means together Podemos, together we can, in masculine, then Unidas Podemos, also UP, which means the same, but in feminine. And this only at the national level. Then Podemos has been competing under very different labels in different places. At the right-hand side, we had Vox. So the party started to be there. Podemos was successful. I will discuss a little bit later where Podemos was successful earlier than Vox. And Vox at the beginning was still a very unsuccessful party. The first 4 and say even 5 years, Vox was born in 2014, well, December 13, and until December 18, it got barely nothing. Some councillors in some town halls, about 26 or something like that. That's the best they got. Results from 0.07% to barely say about 2%, perhaps a little bit more. By the way, the worst result was achieved by Santiago Abascal in the Basque Country. So it seemed it was going to be there, to go to the same place as all other far-right parties. And now the situation is quite different. As you know, Podemos is governing Spain together with the Socialist Party, and Vox is the third largest party in Spain. I remember some days ago I came across a video of a Zoom meeting we had with 2 of my fellows and friends, Jose Ramon Montero and Jose Rama. We were invited to talk in Chile about voting, abstention, and future developments. And it was 1 year and a little bit perhaps before. So what did we have in Chile there? In Chile, we had two main coalitions, which had been, one was led by socialist parties and one was led by the traditional right. It is true that the traditional right is quite right-wing in Chile, much more than what we are accustomed to in most European countries. And it is true that the Socialist Party is perhaps more left-wing than many socialist parties there. We had already in Chile, as a third party, a force that could be somewhat seen like Podemos in Spain or like other similar parties in Europe, but it was by far the third largest party. And at the time, the people in Chile were not worried about or not very worried about the possibility that radical parties could become relevant players in the field. In a sense, they felt, well, that's something that happens in Europe, and especially radical right. You know, radical right is mostly a European thing with some few exceptions in Latin America, but we are more Latin America is no country for angry men, any of the countries. So what have we been seeing in Latin American countries? You see Chile, you see Peru, you see most of the places or several of the places where we have had elections in the last times. What we saw is that the two big candidates have been a radical left and a radical right candidate, or at least a far left and a far right, because some of the candidates may not be radical right, but extreme right candidates in Latin America. So I would say that this should make us think, make us reflect that there is the risk for many countries for these parties to become really important actors in the game, even in countries where we have not seen them before. And we should not minimize this possibility, as we are seeing more and more countries being dominated by the importance of these parties in politics. In some countries, some of the bubble has faded away. In some others, it hasn't. There are good reasons for this bubble not to fade away, not to fade in Spain, I would say. Why? We have a party system which gives a bonus to large parties, quite a large bonus to large parties, because we have 52 at the national level, we have 52 districts, but many of those districts are small. This means barriers of entry are high, but once they are surpassed, some of the parties become important players. This has usually traditionally meant that the traditional left-wing party, PSOE, always got a prize, usually got a prize. The traditional right-wing party, the PP, traditionally got a prize, and that mid-sized parties had a hard time being there, and there was certainly little space for several mid-sized parties at the national level. So we have seen some dancing there. 2015 and 2016, we have important party Unidas Podemos, populist radical left party at that time at least. 2019 April, the largest party is Citizens, a party in the middle of the political spectrum. 2019 B, it is Vox, a populist radical right party. This cannot last for long. We have no space in Spain for 5 important parties. We probably have no space for 3. Citizens is already disappearing, and possibly, I would say, Podemos will disappear as it is now. Podemos will possibly become what was United Left before, will become a party with maybe 8–10% of the vote, with some niche voting there, but possibly will not be the third party for a good while. It will be possibly Vox, who will stay as a third party there. And once you are there, it is quite difficult after the fight for other parties to take that place. So when the window of opportunity opens, if the window is well profited by certain parties, then something really important should happen for you to lose that space. In the case of Spain, the window opened first at the left-hand side of the political space, because the PSOE was governing when the financial crisis was important, and it was first mainly replaced by the traditional right-wing party. But on top of being replaced by the traditional right-wing party, the PSOE was quite weak, and it suffered competition from the 2 flanks, from Podemos at the left of the PSOE, the populist left, and from Citizens at its right, a center party. That competition was first resolved in favor of Podemos and somewhat later in favor of Citizens, although that was going to last short. Later, however, with dissatisfaction not only for the PSOE, but also for the traditional right-wing party, the flank opened also at the right. And that's when Vox, who started being unsuccessful, saw its opportunity to come there. So the flanks were opening, and the competition changed, and but once things are stabilized, possibly we will have a party system composed by mainly a socialist party, traditional right-wing party, and Vox. And this will be our party system, plus some regional parties, plus not so minor, but not so important party at the left of the PSOE, which is different from what we had before. We had a third national party, although not too important for most of the time, at the left-hand side and not at the right-hand side. And this will be the consequences of successive insatisfaction with the traditional main parties. Insatisfaction with traditional main parties and insatisfaction with some of the way democracy works opens the door for political entrepreneurs to profit the occasion. And once they profit it, they may stay there. Look at France. In France, there is no place for the traditional left. And possibly there will be no place for the traditional left for many years, because it's almost impossible to present a socialist candidate that it's who is a credible candidate who can go to the second round. So we are possibly stuck with this type of competition in France. And it is only a matter of time for the radical right to end up winning sometimes, when people are sometimes really fed up with the other party who is governing there. So, in my opinion, there is something, I will out an unpopular view here, but our traditional parties have not been working well for a good time. And this is something that the population has been perceiving. And this has been opening up the place here in Latin America. By here I meant Southern Europe, but also in other European countries. This is opening the place for far right, far left, populist parties, and for other types of parties, but populist parties are being quite successful at profiting this window now, because they are, and that will be possibly Daphne's question, one of their elements is being anti-elite, and our elites have proved to be quite unsatisfactory for a large part of the citizenry. In some respect, this is not their fault. Some things are complicated, but in some things there is. And if they do not do their job properly, I think we will be holding this type of meetings for quite a long time, for at least for several years to come. And well, I won't give details of demand. I may talk, we may talk later about demographics. In Spain, the demographics are somewhat different, not so different, but for instance, they are younger voters, which is even more worrying, because they will keep on voting for more time. With my data, they are not rural; they are urban voters. We may discuss that with Daphne, but I better leave the space to the floor to ask questions, and I am ready to provide for more details. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions to start for André? Sofia?
So it's kind of more of a comment than a question, but I want to make the point that you made about anti-elite. I think is very interesting. Let's say mainstream elites are not doing their best, right? My question is, or my comment is, actually quite a lot of far right, certainly far right, I'm talking because I know more about that, are not doing that well either, in the sense that look at Austria, right? Scandals in association with receiving money from Russia, what have you. Look at Marine Le Pen. There was this recent thing that Daphne highlighted to me, that she issued her manifesto in the run-up to the elections, and she has a picture shaking hands with Putin. So clearly they're not doing something well either, right? How is it that corruption or these kind of dubious practices are problematic when it comes to mainstream politicians, but less problematic when it comes to Marine Le Pen or the FPO in Austria or what have you? It's more something I'm trying to kind of understand myself in a way. So it's not a criticism, just more of a comment, and I don't know, I would like to hear your thoughts.
Sorry, Andre, let me take Maximilian's question as well too, and then
that was my question, if you wanted to accumulate or not. Yeah,
I think I will, because I'm also conscious of time. Maximilian.
Thank you. My question is quite a bit different though. I was more curious about, you mentioned that the Spanish system is in a way not built to accommodate too many sort of significant players. And you mentioned that you thought it was more likely for Podemos to fade into sort of the lower end of the spectrum again, rather than Vox. And I just wanted to ask you to expand on that. Why you see Vox as the more successful player long term, and B, what kind of factors you see that would influence Podemos's decline down the line.
Okay. I'll answer them in the same order they were asked. The first one about corruption. Of course, I mean, challengers may do a bad job, and sometimes this means that there come more challenges are there. I mean, in this regard, France is very much like Italy. A long time they have these parties, so they have had time to commit mistakes, and they are facing competition with parties in a place similar in a similar place in the political spectrum, much as the Lega Nord is facing competitions by Fratelli d'Italia. Rassemblement is facing competition. Well, now you see Le Pen and Zemmour, it's facing fierce competition at the same in a very close position of the political spectrum. Eventually, if many of the parties may commit mistakes as well, but eventually some of them may not. And that's dangerous to the extent we might believe that it's dangerous that they come to power. The second thing is that some of them are newcomers to politics and are unexperienced. Some of them are not, because many of them are party splits. You commented that for Greece, but that would be the same case in Spain. And actually, as they are since long in politics, they know very well, for instance, the resource of the judiciary, and they are winning several court decisions, which, let me be polemic again, some of them, it's good that they win them, because in some of them, they are correcting, even though they are the radical right, they are correcting some mistakes committed by traditional parties, which may point to the possibility that sometimes some of the things that are done by the radical right are not necessarily wrong. And as long as we do not admit that, we will consider that people are crazy voting for them, and that some of them might vote them because some of the things they do are right, although many of them are problematic. But we must understand that they do not always commit mistakes. With regard to Podemos and Vox, if you see the evolution of electoral support for Podemos and its brands, what you see in the last years is that election after election, Podemos and its brands are losing electoral ground. And sometimes in Spain, looking at what is happening in regional elections is quite useful to know what will happen at general elections, because at the regional elections, by definition, we have many more seats in competition. So the parties who are experiencing problems at the regional level will experience fierce problems at the national level, and the parties who are doing pretty well at the regional level are likely not to experience many problems at the national level. So what happened in the 5 or 6 elections we have had since the national elections? There were elections in Galicia, in the Basque Country, in Catalonia, in Madrid, and in Castile Leon, in 5 regions. In these 5 regions, Podemos got, if you see the seats they got in the national parliament from these 5 regions, out of all the seats they got close to 50% in those regions. 45, 50, I think 47, 48% of the seats, they got them in these regions. In all, if they repeated the results they had in the last regional elections in these 5 places, they would get half those votes. Instead of 18 seats, they would get, they would get 6 instead of 18 seats there. I know they are different elections, so they may get more, but this clearly points to a strong erosion of the voter base of Podemos in Spain. With regard to Vox, what we are seeing is that even during the days where the traditional right was becoming stronger, days which are not so clearly now to still be the case, Vox maintained its importance. It became the most important right-wing party in the Catalan elections. it became, it held its strength in the Madrid elections, where the Madrid candidate of the traditional conservative People's Party won by a landslide, and it increased somewhat its results with regard to the national elections, and it multiplied by 10 or so the results it obtained in the past regional elections in Castile Leon. So it has been doing well, even in a context where the People's Party was quite strong. This tells, in some of the surveys have even been pointing to the possibility of a sorpaso. I don't believe this is the situation right now, but this points to strength on the side of Vox and weakness on the side of Podemos. That's why I was arguing that if nothing changes, we are running for this type of party system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. I'm going to ask Susana to give her presentation, because I know she's been waiting patiently to tell us more about Portugal. But there are, I also have a question, and I think we will have a closing with a sort of more discussion and question in the end. So we'll get back to you. But Susana, please enlighten us on the Portuguese case.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you are still interested in populism after all this. I would like to start to thank again for the invitation to participate in this great panel. My presentation is focused on Chega, enough in English. It will cover 3 main points. So the latest elections, more specifically on Chega's results and examples of its voters' motivations. A characterization of André Ventura and Chega in the form of a brief analysis of their main frames and stances. And what I call the latent populist sentiments before Chega's emergence. It is related with a study that the data collection was made in 2017 to study the prevalence of populist attitudes in the Portuguese population. So hopefully this will help us understand the extent we could be dealing with deep-rooted attitudes or not. So basically today we are talking about Chega because this political party created in 2019 has been growing exponentially in electoral results. Chega has been described as a radical right party that combines elements of populism and nativism. And until Chega, Portugal and Spain, Vox appeared in Spain a bit before, but until Chega, Portugal was one of the few countries in Europe where this type of parties did not have any electoral impact representation. So Chega was created by André Ventura to run for the 2019 national election. It then had 1.3% of the votes and elected one MP, its leader, André Ventura. Then André Ventura also ran for the 2021 presidential election, mainly to gain further visibility and to disseminate his ideas, as incumbent presidents are usually re-elected, as it was the case of Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. Ventura got 11.9% of the votes in this election, a third place very close to the second most voted for candidate, which was Ana Gomes, a socialist, and that had 13%. And in the 2022 snap election, just a few weeks ago in January, Chega further consolidated his place as the third most voted for party in the country. It had 7.2% and managed to elect 12 MPs. So they now have 12 MPs as parliamentary representation. Support for right-wing populism in Portugal is paradigmatic in some respects. The country was first considered immune to right-wing populism, mainly because of its still close in time authoritarian past with the Salazar regime. The support in Portugal for extreme right-wing proposals had been very limited, close to 1%. There was a party, the National Renewal Party, it grew to 1.5% in one election, but it was more or less that. And in fact, Ventura seems to be well aware of this. And although he has sought direct support of Le Pen, Abascal, or Salvini, when asked about the ideological positioning of his party, he has on some occasions replied that he does not like the designation of radical right, and usually claims that Chega is essentially an anti-system party. In its manifesto, the party is described as a national conservative liberal personalist party. But it's interesting to note that apparently part of Chega's voters also refuse being seen as radical right, and some do not even consider themselves right-wing. A recent poll study showed that those who voted for Chega positioned themselves less on the right than those who voted for the Social Democratic Party, which is center-right. Chega voters also hold more negative evaluations of the state of the country. They see more economic problems in the country. There are more immigrants in the districts where Chega had the best results, and there seems also to be less schools and less hospitals in the districts where Chega had more votes. When we compare to the other districts, of course. More men vote for Chega. Women tend to vote more for left-wing parties. And those with a university degree also vote less for Chega, but Chega is not the party in the Portuguese party system that has more votes from the less educated. This is the Socialist Party. Overall in Portugal, voters with more education vote more for right-wing parties, and younger voters vote more for newer parties. Chega, but not only Chega, also another new party. Well, they say they are not right, but a liberal party. It's called Liberal Initiative. I have collected a few sentences by Chega voters justifying their electoral choice when asked by journalists. So the common denominator seems to be a desire for change. A few examples, and I quote, the previous rulers have not been concerned with the populations. They are not trustworthy. Yes, I'm not afraid to say that I have voted for Chega. Yes, I did. I voted for Chega because enough is enough. There is corruption everywhere, from health to education, and I'm 100% Portuguese. I see Dr. Ventura as one of the very few 100% Portuguese politicians because he cares about us Portuguese. The other politicians only care about themselves. The population wants changes for the better in the region, and the other politicians are not interested in making changes or in fixing what is wrong. I voted for Ventura because his words are all right. Who wants money must work for it. I don't know the other members of the party, but I trust André Ventura because he is different. So basically, these are just a few examples. We can see that some of these voters are part of those who are not happy with the mainstream parties, as Andrés has already mentioned in Spain as well. The thing is that André Ventura has been using this to his advantage, clearly claiming that Chega is an anti-system party, combining this with provocative, straightforward speeches, and all of this gaining strength with this very high visibility. So like other right-wing populists, Ventura is a modern-looking, media-savvy politician. He has successfully integrated social media in his communication strategy, but he does not discard any of the other media outlets. Previously, he was a member of the Social Democratic Party, a candidate backed by this party, and he had a regular presence on television as a football pundit. he left the Social Democratic Party to form Chega. The main features of his discourse include exclusionary ideas, calculated ambivalence, particularly in policy proposals, provocation, and blaming discursive strategies are also very common. Ventura frequently uses the expression and appeals to the righteous Portuguese people, which are contrasted by the dangerous others who are mostly, in his view, the Roma community and the lazy and the criminals, all those who abuse the welfare benefits and have been protected by other politicians. Ventura also frequently appeals to national identity and to an ideal nation. There are some traces of memory politics and the use of historical symbols, as well as of religion and religious appeals. And he very often articulates the anti-system and the anti-establishment sentiments with attacking the elites, attributing blame, and attempting to delegitimize his opponents. You see these elites as undifferentiated and portrays the other parties and politicians as apathetic towards the authentic people, while of course portraying himself as the true representative of the people. So were the people already seeking for different political proposals? So this takes me to the experiment. We've collected the data from a representative sample in 2017. And we were testing adherence to different forms of populism. So anti-elitism, empty populism, right and left-wing populism. We manipulated the content of a news item and then asked a battery of related questions. I will not describe the study in detail now, we don't have time. I will just explain some of its main conclusions that I consider that are more related to the topic of this presentation. So we first asked whether we could find any latent populist sentiments in the Portuguese population in 2017. This data is particularly relevant, represents the aftermath of the Euro crisis in Portugal, which had a huge impact on the population. And 2 years later, in 2019, Chega was created and elected as first MP in a national election. So we analyzed negative stereotypes and blame shifting processes targeting different groups, politicians, immigrants, the wealthy, and took this as evidence of populist sentiments in the population. So the analysis has indeed confirmed populist sentiments in 2017. Of the existing populist sentiments, politicians were the most blamed and the group that was portrayed more negatively, followed by the wealthy and finally the immigrants. The analysis also suggested that the blaming politicians' attitude could be a structural characteristic of the Portuguese population. Not only these attitudes were the most intense, but they also were not circumscribed to specific socio-demographic factors. And in fact, they seem to be transversal to all social groups. Overall, the results also showed that the respondents were more influenced by the news items containing anti-elitism and right-wing populism than by the one that contained left-wing populism. This suggests that the participants were more sensitive to some types of populist claims and potentially more prone to adhere to right-wing populism. Although some respondents resisted to engage directly in populist behavior at the time, our findings suggest that Portugal was not immune to right-wing populist discourses. We also found that anti-immigrant discourses activated more populist behavior than anti-elitism discourses. Nevertheless, and to conclude, I think Chega's success is largely due to how both the Social Democratic Party and the Socialist Party have been ruling the country. as in other places, populism in Portugal seems to be embedded in deep feelings of discontent with politics. So corruption cases, endemic nepotism, justice with many problems that are consistently not addressed by governments, a huge lack of accountability of previous governments, vested interests in influencing policy, journalists and politicians too close for comfort, let's put it this way, the low quality of political journalism, and a growing part of the population feeling that their main concerns and problems are yet to be addressed and solved. So Ventura presented himself and Chega as an alternative to the mainstream politics and has been constructing his image around this notion. In campaigns, he addresses the forgotten Portugal, a reference to all of those who do not feel politically represented by the parties who have been in power. And although Portuguese voters traditionally have tended to prefer stability and certainty, so they voted for the incumbent after the austerity measures that resulted from the euro crisis. This is changing, and the younger voters are more and more leaning towards new parties. So there is an increasing predisposition to vote for parties with alternative positions. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for very, very interesting insights on Chega and its voters. I have already loads of questions, but I'm going to not do that and open the floor and have take any questions. We have some written ones. So let me take questions specific to Susana before we open the floor and have concluded. Let me start in that case, Susana, because I have a question for you. So, and I guess my question is going to take me back to what I sort of initially presented about the comparison, right? So you said that Chega has been increasing its support and that voting is changing, but maybe can we flip that on its head? I might have exactly the opposite question. How come when for the past decade all over Europe, you have far-right parties in government, you have far-right parties as a party of the main opposition, you have lots of right-wing populists and left-wing populists competing with each other, then you have Portugal, which took so long to have any populist party, which even now in just the election that just happened, produced a strong majority vote for the left, for the center left in the first round. And so my question would be, it would be so odd if you had nothing, right? So is Portugal really an indication of this populist trend, or is it actually against the populist trend?
I'm not sure if I fully understand why is it against. The thing in Portugal is that we usually have a delay. Things happen here after they happened many years ago in other places. And this is with everything. We take some time. What I think could have happened is that what we have as a far-right example was a party with basically a very strong discourse against, racist, against immigrants. They were involved in crimes as well, the example from Greece. And the Portuguese voters are actually very conservative. I'm not saying that there is no racism, that is not a strong attitude in the Portuguese electorate. The problem is that people tend not to admit directly, and they tend to basically, and in terms of, I think historically, people have been very concerned with what is politically correct. So we had the new parliament just started 2 days ago, and the discourse by the president of the parliament was basically just addressing Chega and his concerns that we would have more hate speech in Portugal, because Chega now has 12 representatives instead of just one. So basically, I'm not sure if this answers your question. The thing here is that we are having more and more younger voters, and the traditional electorate that, well, it remembers, has a more clear memory of what Salazar dictatorship was, and of what the democratic revolution represented for Portugal, are getting less and less. So basically we have younger voters that do not see themselves represented by the Social Democratic Party or the Socialist Party. And although the Socialist Party did win this election, it was basically because people did not like the alternative, which was the president of the Social Democratic Party. So, well, this is the best I can do to answer your question now.
Thank you very much. Bülent has a question.
Thank you very much. My question is that, you know, according to some scholars like Costa Lobo, Portuguese are no different from other European, and around 1/5 of the Portuguese population shares views that would coincide with the ideas of right-wing populist parties. Maybe as an opposite view that you mentioned, that Portuguese follow the other parts of the Europe lately. But Lobo think tank thinks that the Portuguese sharing the same stance in regard of right-wing populist parties. Do you think that Chega has sufficient capacity to attract and capitalize this potential, especially from young generations? And what will be the effect of such a concentration of populist radical right voters on the demand side over the political landscape in the supply side and the overall political system in Portugal? Thank you.
I am not sure if I fully understood all the questions, because I think it's my connection. I was listening with the few cuts. So basically, I think the question was about the Chega's capacity to basically grow even more.
Yes, by capitalizing the potential. According to Lobo, it is 1/5 of Portuguese voters. They have radical right ideas. So whether Chega has potential to attract all of them.
Well, I think these next years will be important for us to understand that, because so far Chega has been a one-man party. So basically Chega is Ventura. Now with 12 MPs, it will be very interesting to see how they are coherent or not, to see how they, what kind of proposals do they have. Ventura has been ambivalent in policy proposals, and I think it's on purpose, basically, because he wants to be with the main, well, he wants to attract as much voters as possible. So basically he wants to be on the right side of public opinion. So basically if the polls say that people are against reinforcing investment in the Portuguese airline company, is against. And if there is a poll that says that, well, 50% of Portuguese are pro investing in the Portuguese company, so he suddenly changes, and he starts to say that it's good to invest in Portuguese symbols as the airline company and so on. So but I think it will be more difficult to control all this with 12 MPs instead of just one. So we will see how they will act as a parliamentary group, what their proposals are, how they can influence the public agenda, the media. Chega is very important in terms of visibility now, because it is kind of an exception. He was kind of an exception, and it captured a lot of the journalists' attention. And I think this has played in his favor. So I think the next years will be really important to see if he can capitalize and grow even more, or if basically it will start decreasing his importance, electoral importance, and also importance in terms of the debates. Well, I think that's it.
Thank you so much. It's amazing that we have actually run out of time, and we said we had 2 hours, so that was plenty to have a conversation, and yet there are still unanswered questions. But I think I should stop it, because we have been. It is now the full 2 hours, and perhaps I don't know if we can. Yeah. So I would say that if you know, feel free to get in touch with the speakers, ask your questions. You know, absolutely, everyone would be happy to answer. I just want to say thank you so much to the speakers. We've heard some really, really interesting and excellent presentations, and I was certainly thinking of the details of each case and trying to draw parallels between the cases. So I think we learned a lot. So thank you for that.